The snow hit the window like static from a dead channel, and that's when I heard it 3 knocks, soft but urgent, the kind that come from someone who doesn't have the strength left to bang harder. I set down my coffee. I wasn't expecting anyone on Christmas Eve, not out here, not in weather like this. When I opened that door and saw my sister standing in the storm with her daughter wrapped against her chest, both of them shaking, both of them soaked to the bone, something in me went cold in a way the weather never could. I didn't know yet what had happened to her. I only knew that whoever did this to my sister had just made the worst mistake of their lives. My name is Brooke Harrison. I'm 38 years old, a colonel in the United States Army, and I've spent the better part of 2 decades learning how to stay calm when everything around me is falling apart. That training has saved lives overseas. That night, it was about to save my sister's. I live alone in a quiet house outside D.C., the kind of place I bought specifically because it was quiet. After deployments, after years of noise and orders and adrenaline, silence became something I craved. I'd made myself a simple dinner that night, nothing fancy, just something warm, because I was spending Christmas Eve by myself again the way I had most years since my divorce. I'd made peace with that a long time ago. Some of us build families, some of us build discipline instead. I told myself that was enough. Then the knock came. I opened the door and there was Emily, my baby sister, 8 years younger than me, standing in 3 inches of snow without a coat that actually kept the cold out. No gloves, her arms wrapped so tightly around her daughter that her knuckles had gone white. Lily was only 1 year old. Her lips had a blue tinge to them that no parent ever wants to see on their child, and she wasn't crying anymore. She'd gone past crying, into that silent, shivering stillness that scared me more than screaming ever could. "Brooke," Emily said, and her voice cracked in half. "He brought his mistress home, on Christmas Eve. He brought her into our house." I didn't ask another question. I pulled them both inside, wrapped Lily in the throw blanket off my couch, and got the fireplace roaring within a minute, because some instincts don't need conscious thought, they just happen. I made Emily sit. I made her drink something warm. I checked Lily's fingers and toes myself, pressing gently, watching for that blanched color that would tell me we needed the ER instead of my living room. It took almost 20 minutes before the baby started to pink up again and let out a real cry, the good kind, the kind that means a body is warming back up. Only then did Emily start to talk. It came out slow at first, then all at once like a levee breaking after years of pressure. She told me about the years I hadn't known, about how her husband's family had treated her like an outsider from the very first Thanksgiving, how his mother had taken control of their joint finances, to help, how that help had turned into Emily needing permission to buy her own daughter formula. She told me her husband had been unfaithful for months, maybe longer, and that she'd known on some level, and stayed quiet because she thought that's what a good wife did. She thought silence was sacrifice. She thought if she just held on a little longer for Lily's sake, things would repair themselves. Tonight they hadn't repaired. Tonight they'd shattered completely. She told me his mistress had walked into their house like she belonged there, taken off her coat in the front hallway, like she'd done it 100 times before, and Emily's mother-in-law had helped pack Emily's clothes into trash bags, while her husband stood by and said nothing. They didn't let her take the car. They didn't let her take her purse. They didn't even let her grab the diaper bag with the formula in it. They opened the door and put a woman and a 1-year-old baby out into a snowstorm on Christmas Eve, and then they locked the door behind them. I sat with that for a long moment, watching my niece finally fall asleep against her mother's shoulder, her small chest rising and falling in that fragile, trusting rhythm that babies have when they don't yet know the world can be cruel. I thought about every training I'd ever had on managing crisis, on keeping my voice level when everything in me wanted to scream. I used every bit of it right then, because I understood something in that moment that I don't think Emily fully understood yet herself. This wasn't a marriage falling apart. People's marriages fall apart every day, and it's sad, and it's private, and it's nobody's business but theirs. This was cruelty. Calculated, deliberate cruelty aimed at a woman and a baby on the coldest night of the year. I looked at my sister's face, still blotchy from crying, and I looked at Lily's tiny fingers curled against the blanket, and something settled in me. Not rage. Not yet, something quieter and far more dangerous than rage. It was resolve. I reached over and took Emily's hand, and I said the only thing that felt true in that moment, the only thing I needed her to hear before we did anything else. They picked the wrong family. Outside, the snow kept falling steady and silent, covering the tracks of the car that had driven her here. But inside my house, something had already begun that no amount of snow was going to bury. The house was quiet by the time Lily finally fell into a real deep sleep, the kind where her whole body went loose and trusting against the makeshift crib I'd made from a laundry basket, and every soft blanket I owned. Emily sat across from me at the kitchen table wrapped in one of my old army sweatshirts, holding a mug of tea she wasn't drinking. I watched her hands shake around that mug, and I realized I was looking at my sister the way I used to look at soldiers who'd just come off a hard mission, that particular kind of exhaustion that isn't about sleep at all. "There's more," she finally said. "Things I never told you." I already suspected there would be. Emily and I had always been close growing up, but somewhere after she married Marcus, the calls got shorter. The visits got rarer. I told myself it was just marriage, just distance, just life moving people in different directions. I hadn't let myself consider the alternative because the alternative meant I'd missed something important happening to someone I loved. She told me everything that night, piece by piece, like she was setting down a weight she'd been carrying so long her arms had gone numb to it. She told me that within the first year of marriage, Marcus's mother Diane had insisted on helping manage their household finances, and that help had slowly become control. Emily's paycheck from her old job went into a joint account that Diane had access to. When Emily wanted to buy something for herself, new shoes, a haircut, anything, she had to ask, not Marcus, Diane. She told me about the time she'd bought a birthday gift for a friend, and Diane had asked her, in front of the whole family, why she was wasting money on people who didn't matter. She told me about the isolation, how slowly, almost gently at first, she'd been steered away from her old friends, her old life, until her entire world revolved around Marcus's family and their schedule, their opinions, their approval. She told me she used to be someone who laughed loudly and made plans and had opinions about things, and somewhere in those years she'd become quiet, careful, small. I sat there listening, and I felt something building in my chest that I recognized from a different life, the particular focused anger that comes right before I make a decision I don't walk back from. But I didn't let it show on my face. I've spent too many years learning that the moment you let people see your anger, you give them power to manage you through it. I kept my voice level. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, though I already half knew the answer. "Because you would have done something," Emily said, and for the first time that night she almost smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "You always do something, Brooke. I didn't want you to blow up your life over mine. I thought I could fix it myself." I reached across the table and took her hand, the one not holding the mug, and I told her something I believed completely. "You're not fixing anything alone anymore." That was the moment something shifted in me from grief into strategy. I want to be honest about what I felt sitting there because I think people romanticize revenge as some kind of fire that consumes you. It wasn't fire. It was clarity. It was the exact same feeling I used to get before a mission briefing when all the noise falls away, and what's left is just the plan, clean and quiet and absolute. I picked up my phone that night at nearly 1 a.m, and I started making calls the next day that I hadn't made in years, not out of anger, but out of precision. I called Daniel Reyes, a family law attorney I'd worked with years before on a case for a fellow officer, a man who didn't flinch at ugly details and didn't waste time on sympathy when what people needed was action. I called a private investigator named Trevor Wu, someone I trusted from a security consulting job I'd done after retirement research. Someone thorough and quiet and very, very good at finding what people thought they'd hidden. I called a forensic CPA, a woman named Patricia Alvarez, who had a reputation for finding money that families like Marcus's thought was buried deep enough to never surface again. I wasn't calling them for revenge. I want to be clear about that, even now looking back. I was calling them because my sister had been quietly stripped of her power for years, and the only way to give it back to her permanently was to understand exactly what had been taken and exactly how. While I made those calls, Marcus's family carried on like nothing had happened. Emily showed me the Facebook post 2 days after Christmas. Diane's smiling face at the head of the dinner table, string lights glowing behind her, Marcus's arm, around the woman who used to sit in Emily's chair. The caption read something about family being everything during the holidays. 43 likes, comments about how lovely they all looked. They genuinely believed that Emily would come crawling back within the week, apologetic, desperate, alone. They believed the cold and the shame and the lack of money would bring her to their door begging for forgiveness for a sin she never committed. Emily read the comments with her jaw-tight, tears standing in her eyes but not falling. "They think I'm going back," she said quietly. I looked at my sister at the new hardness settling behind her eyes, the first sign of the woman she used to be before they wore her down. "No," I told her. "They're coming to us." 3 days later, my phone rang. It was Daniel. "Brooke," he said, and something in his voice told me this was only the beginning. "There's some things you need to see." I met Daniel Reyes at his office 2 days after New Year's, a small conference room with law books that looked like they'd actually been read, not just displayed. He had a manila folder in front of him that looked thin, almost unremarkable, but the look on his face told me not to underestimate what was inside it. "I want to start with the money," he said, "because that's usually where people like this get sloppy." Trevor Wu had been busy in the background for a week and a half, and Patricia Alvarez even longer, and between the two of them what they'd built wasn't just a picture of a bad marriage. It was a picture of a family that had spent years assuming no one would ever look closely enough to catch them. Marcus, it turned out, had opened a separate account almost 2 years earlier. One Emily never knew existed. Funded quietly through transfers, skimmed off their joint savings a little at a time, never enough in one transaction to draw attention, but enough over 2 years to add up to almost $40,000. Patricia found hotel charges, jewelry purchases, a weekend trip to Charleston, that Emily remembered Marcus telling her was a work conference. None of it had ever touched their shared bank statements in a way Emily would have seen, because Diane had set up the household accounts years earlier specifically so that Emily received only summary printouts, never full statements. That detail sat with me for a long moment. It hadn't been carelessness. It had been architecture. Someone had built a system brick by brick designed specifically to keep my sister blind to her own life. Then there was Diane. Trevor had pulled property records, refinancing documents, and a small business loan application Diane had filed 18 months earlier for a boutique she co-owned with a friend. Buried in the paperwork was Emily's signature co-signing a $15,000 loan. Emily had never signed that loan. She didn't even know the boutique existed. "It's not a perfect match," Daniel said carefully, sliding the comparison sheet across the table, showing Emily's real signature next to the one on the loan documents. "But a forensic document examiner will have a field day with this. It's close, but the pressure points are wrong. Whoever forged it was in a hurry." I sat back in my chair and let that settle. Diane hadn't just controlled Emily's spending. She had used Emily's identity, her credit, her name, without her knowledge, to fund her own business. And Marcus's father, it turned out, had been quietly shifting the family's real estate holdings into a trust that conveniently excluded any assets that might be considered marital property in a divorce. A maneuver Patricia said only made sense if someone had been anticipating this exact scenario for a long time. They hadn't just mistreated my sister. They'd been preparing for years for the day she might finally leave, making sure that when she did, she'd have nothing to leave with. I didn't say much in that meeting. I've learned that the most dangerous thing you can do with information like this is react to it too quickly. I asked Daniel what our options were, listened to the timeline he laid out, and told him to keep building. Quietly, thoroughly, no warning shots. Back at my house, something different was happening. Something that mattered just as much as any folder of evidence. Emily was starting to come back to life. I watched her stand a little straighter each day. I watched her make her own coffee in the morning without checking in with anyone about it. Small things, almost invisible things. But I noticed because I remembered what she used to be like before Marcus's family had spent years sanding down her confidence into something small and cautious. She started sleeping through the night for the first time in longer than she could remember. She told me that one morning over breakfast, almost embarrassed by how much it meant to her. "I haven't slept without waking up at 3 a.m. in years," she said, watching Lily bang a spoon against her high chair tray, giggling at nothing in particular. I forgot what that felt like. I took Lily to her pediatrician that week, mostly out of my own need to be certain to have a medical professional confirm what my instincts already told me. Dr. Whitfield examined her carefully, checked her extremities, asked about the exposure timeline Emily gave her. "You got her inside in time," she told me, her expression serious in a way that made my chest tighten. "But if she'd been out there another 20-30 minutes in that cold, we could have been looking at real hypothermia. Something serious. You did the right thing bringing her straight in." I nodded, kept my face composed the way I'd trained myself to for 2 decades, and thanked her. But walking back to the car with Lily bundled against the January wind, something in me closed like a fist. 20 minutes. That was the margin between an angry family drama and a tragedy that would have followed my sister for the rest of her life. I buckled Lily into her car seat, watched her wave her mittened hands at nothing, laughing oblivious to how close she'd come to something none of us would have recovered from. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment, before starting the engine, staring straight ahead at the pediatrician's office, feeling the calm settle back over me, the way it always did right before I moved. They had gambled with a baby's life to save themselves an uncomfortable conversation, and they had done it believing there would be no consequences at all. I started the car and looked in the rearview mirror at my niece, safe and warm, and completely unaware of what was coming for the people who'd put her out in the snow. "Now," I said quietly, mostly to myself, "they answer for everything." They must have expected silence, because silence was what Emily had given them for years. What they got instead was a text message from an unknown number that read simply, "We need to talk about what you did to my family. Come home now, or you'll regret it." Emily showed it to me with her hand trembling, not from fear this time, but from something closer to disbelief that they'd try this at all. That was the opening move. Within 48 hours, it escalated into a barrage: texts from Marcus, an email from Diane laced with scripture about the sanctity of marriage, and finally a letter from a lawyer claiming to represent the family, threatening Emily with a custody battle if she didn't return home and stop this nonsense immediately. The letter suggested Emily was unstable, unemployed, and being manipulated by an overbearing sister with a controlling personality. I read that line twice. Then I laughed once, short and humorless, because it was such a transparent attempt to flip the script that it almost impressed me. They were trying to make me the villain before anyone had even asked a real question. "They think if they scare me enough, I'll come crawling back," Emily said, staring at her phone like it might bite her. "They're not wrong that they're trying," I said. "They're just wrong about who they're dealing with." I didn't respond to a single message myself. I let Daniel handle it, and he did in the most devastating way possible. Not with anger, not with threats, but with 28 pages of documented fact. Bank records, timestamps, the forged loan signature laid beside Emily's real one. A summary of the joint account transfers going back 2 years. A note politely worded informing Marcus's family's attorney that any further contact with Emily directly, rather than through counsel, would be treated as harassment and documented accordingly. Daniel called me the day after he sent it. "You should have seen how fast their lawyer stopped talking about custody," he said. "Some people threaten because they think you have nothing. The moment they realize you have receipts, the whole conversation changes." It changed, but not in the direction Marcus wanted. 2 days later, he showed up at my house. I heard the tires first too fast on the icy road, then the slam of a car door, then fists against my front door hard enough to rattle the wreath hanging on it. Emily went pale in the kitchen, pulling Lily against her chest instinctively. I told her to stay back, and I meant it, because whatever was about to happen on my porch, I didn't want my niece anywhere near it. I opened the door in jeans and an old army sweatshirt, nothing intimidating about my appearance, and that seemed to throw him for a second, like he'd expected someone smaller, someone easier to push past. "Where is she?" Marcus said, his voice too loud for the quiet street, his breath fogging in the cold. "I want to see my daughter." "She's not here for you," I said, and I kept my voice level, almost bored, because I'd learned a long time ago that calm unsettles people who are looking for a fight far more than shouting ever could. "This isn't your business, Brooke. This is between me and my wife." "You made it my business the night you put her out in a snowstorm with your daughter." His face went red, and for a moment I genuinely thought he might try to shove past me into the house, and some old quiet part of me, the part trained for exactly this kind of moment, was already calculating distance leverage, what I'd need to do if he tried it. He took one step forward. "Leave," I said. Just that, one word, flat and final. He laughed an ugly sound and reached for the door frame like he intended to force his way in anyway. That was the exact moment 2 patrol cars pulled up along the curb lights, silent but unmistakable, because I'd called the non-emergency line the second I heard his car speeding down my street, recognizing the make from the family Christmas photos Emily had shown me. The officers were calm professional, the kind of calm that comes from doing this exact scenario 100 times before. They separated us, asked questions, took statements. My doorbell camera had caught the whole thing. His fist against the door, his raised voice, his attempt to force entry into a private residence where a restraining order request was already conveniently in process. He was cited for disorderly conduct and criminal trespass that night, standing in my driveway under the porch light with his expensive coat and his furious, humiliated face, while a neighbor 2 houses down watched from her window with her phone very obviously recording. Emily stood in the hallway afterward, Lily asleep against her shoulder, watching the patrol cars pull away through the front window. Her face had a stillness to it I hadn't seen since before that Christmas Eve knock, something settling into place behind her eyes. "I don't want him back," she said, quiet but absolutely certain, the words coming out like she'd finally set down something she'd been carrying too long. I don't think I ever really did. I think I just didn't know how to stop being afraid of what would happen if I left. I put my arm around her shoulders, feeling how much lighter she seemed already, even after everything. "You're not afraid anymore," I said. "And you're never going back to being." Outside the porch, light caught the fresh snow starting to fall again, quiet, steady, nothing like the storm of that first night. Marcus's taillights disappeared down the street, and for the first time I let myself believe that the next time we saw each other, it would be somewhere with a judge between us and receipts instead of threats. The courtroom on the 3rd floor of the county courthouse smelled like old carpet, and coffee fluorescent lights humming overhead in that flat, indifferent way that makes everything feel smaller than it is. Marcus's family had hired David Kessler, a divorce attorney known around the county for winning cases that looked unwinnable, the kind of man who wore his confidence like cologne. Diane sat beside her son in a cream-colored suit, hair done, makeup soft and sympathetic. The picture of a grieving mother-in-law rather than a woman who'd forged a signature and helped throw a baby out into a snowstorm. I sat behind Emily with my hand on the back of her chair, close enough that she could feel me there without needing to look back and check. Kessler opened strong the way I expected he would. He painted Emily as fragile, unstable, a woman who had abandoned the marital home without provocation, who had a history of emotional volatility, who was now conveniently under the influence of an older sister with a controlling personality and a military background that made her, in his words, accustomed to giving orders and expecting obedience. He mentioned my rank like it was a character flaw. He suggested Emily hadn't worked in 3 years because she lacked ambition, not because Diane had insisted early in the marriage that Emily's place was at home. I felt Emily stiffen in front of me, her shoulders drawing up toward her ears, and I leaned forward just enough to murmur, "Let him talk. Talk is all he has left." When it was our turn, Daniel didn't raise his voice once. He didn't need to. He built the case the way you build a wall, 1 brick at a time, until there was no way around it and no way through it. He entered the bank records first, walking the judge through 2 years of quiet transfers from the joint account into the account Marcus thought no one would ever find. He entered the hotel charges, the jewelry purchases, the Charleston trip billed as a work conference that had no corresponding expense report from Marcus's employer. Patricia Alvarez took the stand and explained in the calm, precise language of someone who has done this 100 times, exactly how the money moved and where it ended up. Then came the loan documents. Daniel placed 2 signatures side by side on the projector screen, Emily's real signature from her driver's license renewal, and the signature on the boutique loan application. A forensic document examiner, a small unassuming man named Harold Voss, walked the courtroom through pressure points, stroke direction, letter formation, explaining in methodical detail why the second signature was not in fact Emily's hand. I watched Diane's face during that testimony. The soft, grieving expression cracked for just a second, a flicker of panic quickly smoothed back over, but not quick enough. The judge noticed too. I saw her write something down. Dr. Whitfield testified next, describing Lily's condition the night she was brought in, the risk of hypothermia in an infant exposed to freezing temperatures for even a short window. The fact that Emily had made exactly the right call, getting her inside quickly. It was clinical, unemotional testimony which somehow made it land harder than any dramatic account could have. A room full of people who'd been treating this like a business dispute were suddenly reminded that a 1-year-old had been standing in a snowstorm. Trevor Wu testified about the trust Marcus's father had quietly restructured 18 months earlier, moving assets in a pattern that, in his professional opinion, suggested deliberate preparation for exactly this kind of proceeding. By the time Kessler stood to cross-examine, something in the room had shifted. He tried to rattle Patricia on the stand, tried to suggest the transfers could have innocent explanations, and she answered every question calmly, citing dates and amounts from memory that made his suggestions sound flimsy the moment they left his mouth. He tried the same with Harold Voss and got the same result. You cannot cross-examine your way out of a signature that doesn't match. Then Marcus took the stand himself, and that was where it truly fell apart. He contradicted himself twice within 10 minutes, first claiming he didn't know about the second bank account, then, under gentle pressure from Daniel, admitting he'd opened it himself but insisting it was for emergencies. He couldn't explain the Charleston trip without stumbling over his own timeline. When Daniel asked him directly whether he'd known his mother was planning to help Emily and Lily leave the house that Christmas Eve, without a coat, without a car, without formula for the baby, he went quiet for almost 15 seconds before saying, "I didn't think it through." The judge, a sharp-eyed woman named Judge Okafor, who had said very little through the whole proceeding, finally spoke. "You didn't think it through," she repeated, flat, unreadable. "There was a 1-year-old outside in a snowstorm and you didn't think it through." Diane took the stand next and made it worse. She denied helping pack Emily's things, denied any knowledge of the loan, denied controlling the household finances, at all, describing herself as simply someone who liked to help. But Daniel had the loan application time-stamped the security footage from Emily's old phone backup, showing Diane's hands folding clothes into trash bags, that Christmas Eve time-stamped, dated undeniable. Diane's composure slipped for good under Judge Okafor's questioning, her voice rising defensive, contradicting her own earlier statements twice in the span of 5 minutes. I watched the family's lawyer's face during that testimony, watched the particular stillness of a man realizing his clients had lied to him about the strength of their own case. Kessler didn't object as much after that. There wasn't much left to object to. By the time the judge called a recess, Marcus wouldn't look at his mother. Diane wouldn't look at anyone. And somewhere in that quiet, humiliated silence between them, I saw it settle in the understanding that they had walked into this courtroom certain they would win, and they were about to lose everything. Judge Okafor's ruling came down 11 days later, delivered in a courtroom half as full as the one during testimony, most of the spectators having lost interest once the outcome became obvious to anyone paying attention. Emily sat beside me in the same navy blazer she'd worn to every hearing, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and I watched her knuckles go white as the judge began to read. Full custody of Lily, granted to Emily with supervised visitation only for Marcus, contingent on completed counseling, and a demonstrated pattern of stability the court would review in 6 months. Child support calculated against Marcus's actual income, the real number Patricia had uncovered, not the modest salary he'd claimed on his initial financial disclosure. An equitable division of marital assets that accounted for the funds diverted into his hidden account, meaning Emily's share increased to offset what he'd already taken. Attorney's fees awarded to Emily, the judge noting explicitly that the volume and complexity of concealment on Marcus's side had directly increased the cost of litigation. I felt Emily exhale beside me, a long, shaking breath that seemed to release something she'd been holding since that first knock on my door. She didn't cry in the courtroom. She waited until we were back in my car engine, running heat blasting against the January cold, before she put her face in her hands and finally let it out. Not sobs exactly, more like something draining out of her all at once. "It's over," she said, muffled through her fingers. "That part is..." I told her, pulling out of the parking lot. "But there's more coming for them, just not from us." I meant the IRS. Patricia's forensic work hadn't stayed contained to the family court proceeding. Some of what she'd uncovered, the pattern of diverted funds, the loan fraud, the discrepancies in Marcus's reported income against his employer's payroll records, met the threshold for referral. Daniel filed the appropriate reports as a matter of standard practice, the kind of thing attorneys do quietly, without fanfare, when evidence of financial fraud surfaces during litigation. Within 6 weeks, Emily got a call from an investigator confirming the family business, the small commercial property management company Marcus's father ran, was now under audit. It didn't stop there. The bank that had processed Diane's boutique loan, once alerted to the forged signature, opened its own internal review, and the loan was called in full due immediately at a moment when the boutique itself was already struggling. The business closed within 4 months. I heard through Emily's old neighborhood group chat, which she still quietly monitored, even after everything, that the storefront sat empty with a for-lease sign in the window by spring. The social fallout moved faster than any of the legal consequences. Word travels in tight communities, and Marcus's family had spent years cultivating a particular image, generous, devout pillars of their church and their neighborhood association. That image didn't survive a public custody hearing with testimony about forged signatures and a baby left in a snowstorm. Emily told me people from Diane's old book club stopped inviting her to things. The pastor at their church, who'd once given a sermon praising Diane's charitable spirit, quietly distanced the congregation from the family after enough parishioners raised concerns. Marcus's mistress left him within weeks of the ruling, once it became clear there was far less money than she'd been led to believe, and far more scandal attached to his name than she'd signed up for. Emily heard this secondhand too from a mutual friend who couldn't resist passing along the irony. Marcus came to my house one more time in early spring, this time without pounding on the door, without shouting. He stood on my porch in a coat that looked a size too big for him now, like he'd lost weight he couldn't afford to lose, and asked quietly if he could talk to me for a minute. I stood in the doorway, not inviting him in, not yet ready to extend that particular grace. "I know I made mistakes," he said. "I just want a chance to explain some of it. To Emily, maybe to you. I thought about the 20 minutes Dr. Whitfield had mentioned, the margin between what happened and a tragedy none of us would have recovered from. I thought about Diane folding clothes into trash bags while a 1-year-old stood in the cold. I thought about every excuse, every softened word he might offer, and how none of it would undo a single thing that had happened. Talk to your lawyer, I said, and I closed the door gently without slamming it because he didn't deserve the satisfaction of thinking he'd gotten to me enough for that. Through the window, I watched him stand on the porch for a moment longer before walking back to his car, shoulders hunched against a wind that wasn't nearly as cold as the one that had driven Emily to my door months earlier. He drove away, and I didn't watch to see where he went. It didn't matter anymore. He wasn't our problem to solve. Inside, Emily was in the kitchen, feeding lily-strained peaches, laughing at the mess her daughter was making of her own face, entirely unbothered by the visitor who'd just left. She didn't ask who'd been at the door. She didn't need to. Whatever it was, she trusted me to have handled it, the same trust I'd earned back in December when I opened my door and pulled her in out of the snow. I watched the two of them from the kitchen doorway, flour dust from breakfast still on the counter, morning light coming through clean and pale, and I understood, maybe for the first time fully, that the version of justice I'd spent months building for my sister wasn't really about punishing Marcus's family at all. It was about this kitchen, this peace. A little girl laughing over mashed peaches, her mother laughing back, neither of them looking over their shoulder anymore. A year had passed since that Christmas Eve knock, and my house looked nothing like it had that night. Lights wrapped the porch railing in warm gold. The tree in the living room stood a little crooked, because Lily had insisted on decorating the bottom third of it herself, ornaments clustered together at toddler height like a small, glittering traffic jam. The snow outside fell the same way it had the year before, steady and quiet, but everything it landed on now felt different. Emily walked into the kitchen wearing an apron dusted with flour, humming something under her breath, checking on a batch of sugar cookies she'd insisted on making from scratch this year, instead of buying the store kind like we used to. She had a job now, a real one, coordinating logistics for a regional healthcare nonprofit work she'd found on her own, applied for, on her own interviewed for, on her own 3 months after the ruling came down. She told me once early on that the first paycheck she deposited into an account with only her name on it felt like breathing after holding her breath for years without realizing it. Lily was 2 now, steady on her feet, currently attempting to climb onto the couch with the single-minded determination only a toddler can bring to furniture. She'd gained back every bit of the softness that cold night had nearly stolen from her cheeks, round and pink voice loud and constant, filling the house with a kind of noise I'd once thought I preferred without, back when silence felt like the safest thing I could offer myself. I knew better now. Some silences aren't peace. They're just absence waiting to be filled. I was still serving Colonel Harrison during the week, still handling briefings and readiness reports and everything the uniform required of me. But I'd restructured things where I could requested postings that kept me closer to home, traded some of what used to be exclusively mine for evenings like this one, watching my niece attempt to scale furniture while her mother iced cookies badly and laughed about it. I used to believe the biggest victory available to me was making sure people who hurt the ones I loved paid for it in full. I'd built an entire year around that belief, methodically, patiently, the way I'd been trained to build anything that mattered. And we had won in every measurable sense. Marcus lost nearly everything that made his old life recognizable. Diane's name carried a different weight now in every room she walked into. The consequences had been real, thorough, deserved. But sitting in my living room that second Christmas Eve, watching Lily finally conquer the couch cushion with a triumphant shriek, I understood something I hadn't fully grasped during all those months of depositions and courtroom testimony. The victory was never really about them. It was about this room, this noise, this particular ordinary kind of happiness that almost got taken from 2 people I loved, on a night I still sometimes see when I close my eyes. Emily came and sat beside me on the couch later that evening, once Lily had finally worn herself out and gone down for the night, the tree lights the only illumination left in the room. She handed me something small, wrapped carelessly in leftover wrapping paper, the kind of imperfect wrapping job that told me she'd done it herself, rather than having someone else handle it. Inside was a scarf, hand-knitted, slightly uneven in places, deep green with a few dropped stitches near one end that she hadn't bothered to hide. "I taught myself that first winter," she said, her voice quieter than it had been all evening. "After everything, I needed something to do with my hands that wasn't just surviving. This was the first thing I finished." I held it for a moment, feeling the uneven texture of it, thinking about everything those months had actually cost her to rebuild one small, deliberate choice at a time. "You didn't just save us that night," she said, watching the tree lights instead of me like it was easier to say this way. "You gave us our future." I didn't have a clever response to that. I just put my arm around her shoulders the way I had in my driveway the night the police cars pulled away, and we sat there together watching snow collect on the windowsill outside, listening to the house settle into that particular quiet that comes after a long day of good ordinary noise. Outside, the snow kept falling exactly the way it had fallen the year before, covering the same driveway, the same porch steps. But this time, no one stood shivering on the other side of that door. This time, everyone who needed to be warm was already inside. Some people think revenge means winning in a courtroom, watching someone else lose everything you believe they took from you. I understand that impulse. I lived inside it for months. But I've come to believe something quieter, something that took me the better part of a year of ordinary Tuesdays and school pickups and sugar cookies to fully understand. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't destroying the people who hurt you. It's building a life so full of peace, love, and dignity that they can never take another thing from you. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to know where it found you tonight. Drop a comment and let me know what part of Brooke and Emily's story stayed with you the most. We've got so many more stories like this one waiting to be told, so subscribe if you don't want to miss the next one. Let's keep walking through these journeys together.